So the first step in the investing process is to weigh your object, sprue and all. So I'm going to put my object on the left side of the balance beam. And I'm going to add weights to see how heavy it is. It's really important to know the weight of your object because that's how much metal is going to go in there. So that's balanced pretty much enough. I have 7 grams of weight on here, so I have 7 grams of wax. I could have used the slide to get me to 7 grams. And so I could have, you know, it should be pretty close to there. So that 7 grams means I need 70 grams of metal to go into this piece. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is I need to find an appropriate flask for this object. We keep our flasks up here, and they should always be on their sides like this so we can choose one easily. You want to choose the smallest flask possible that your piece will fit in. So I'm going to start with this one. Now, what I'm looking for is I need at least a 1/2 inch of space from the top, and I need at least 1/4 of an inch of space from between my object and the sides of the flask. Any less than that and you risk the plaster investment cracking, and if it cracks, your metal will travel through that crack and out the end of the mold. This looks like a good size for this object, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. So now that I have my flask, I need to find the appropriate sized rubber bottom to go on that flask. I found that the rubber bottoms are in the drawer right under where the flasks are, and I need to secure my object into that rubber bottom. Now this is a little too tall. Ideally, we only want a 1/2 inch from the top of this rubber bottom to where our object starts. So I'm going to take a little bit of material off of this before I secure it in there. Now I don't need to reweigh it. That isn't going to make that much of a difference. This looks a lot better. Now I don't have quite so much distance that my metal needs to travel for no reason. Now I need to secure this in the rubber bottom, and there's a couple different ways to do that. There is some plasticine clay in the drawer where the rubber bottoms are kept. What I'm going to do instead though is I'm going to fill this with wax. Okay, so I have filled the rubber bottom with wax to make it secure. A good way to test if your object is securely attached is to turn it upside down. It should stay in place. It shouldn't come loose. If it's not securely attached, what could happen is when you pour your plaster in, it floats up to the top surface. The next step is to put my flask on my rubber bottom, kind of start from one side and work your way around nice and gentle. You don't want to dislodge anything. I'm going to double check what that looks like inside. It's a little close to one side, but I'm still within that 1/4 inch tolerance. And then I'm going to double check from the top. So a way to tell how deep something is to lay something across it. That's clearly more than 1/2 inch, so I'm good to go. Okay, so now it's time to mix plaster. Before you mix plaster, you want to take a moment to make sure everything is ready. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have to stop and have to go get something or fix something or clean something or move something. Once we start mixing plaster, we have a total of 12 minutes of work time. 6 of those 12 minutes are going to be in the vacuum chamber, so you don't have a whole lot of time to do your mixing and all of that stuff. So you want to make sure that everything is set and everything is ready to go before you add water. I always like to get the water filled into the pitcher ahead of time. Always use cold water. Never, ever, ever use hot water because it will accelerate the process of the plaster setting up. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take some masking tape. We're going to wrap a little bit of masking tape around the top of our flask. The reason why I'm doing this is when I put the flask into the vacuum chamber, it's essentially going to cause that liquid to boil. When it boils, the volume level rises. We want this flask filled all the way to the top. I don't want any space whatsoever. If it's filled all the way to the top and it boils, it's going to boil over. So this little bit of masking tape is going to give us just a little bit extra room to fill up. So to mix our plaster, we're going to use these rubber mixing bowls. Don't use anything else other than a rubber mixing bowl. The plaster is very difficult to clean out of like a plastic container. So I'm going to look for a similar size flask as what I'm using for my mold. And I'm going to scoop 1.5 flasks of plaster. Now technically this is not the way that you're supposed to do it, but this is the way that I was taught, and I have a hard time doing it any other way. So what you're supposed to do is measure the volume of your flask, add that appropriate amount of water, and then mix the proper ratio of plaster to water. I do this by feel, and that's how I was taught. So we're going to scoop 1.5. Now we try to do this without mixing or kicking up as much plaster dust as possible. Plaster dust is very harmful to people. If you inhale enough of it, you can develop a condition called silicosis. That's where your body can't get rid of the plaster, and basically you end up drowning in your own lungs. Miners call it the black lung. So I'm pouring just enough water to cover the top surface here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to keep one hand dry, just in case I need to add a little bit more dry plaster. I have a dry hand that I can reach into the plaster bucket. We never want any moisture going into that plaster bucket. So the clock is ticking. I'm trying to mix quickly, but without whipping air into my mixture. What I am looking for is the consistency of Elmer's glue. Elmer's glue is really important. We don't want milk. Milk is going to be too thin. And we don't want pancake batter. Pancake batter is going to be too thick. If you don't have the right consistency in your mold, if it's too thin, you're going to get a lot of shrinkage and cracking when we fire it. If it's too thick, it's going to set up way too quickly. So we're about there. And when I pull my fingers out, if I can spread them apart and you see how it's kind of running really thick off my fingers and you don't immediately see the tone of my skin, then we're good to go. I'm rinsing my hand in the plaster bucket. And we're back over to our investment, our vacuum machine. I'm going to turn it to investment table and turn it on. Now, if you don't see this needle climb, that means you don't have a good seal. So sometimes it's just a matter of moving this around and you see that needle climb right up. Now, I didn't mention that I got this rubber surface wet. That helps me get a better seal. So right now I'm going to start timing. Okay, so that's been 3 minutes. Always release the vacuum first and then turn off the motor. Never do it in the opposite order. We're going to remove our bell jar. Going to pour into our mold. I try not to pour directly on my objects. And like I said, I want to fill this mold all the way up. I'm not going to get rid of the excess plaster. I might need that to top this off. Okay, 3 minutes again. Don't walk away from this, because if this starts to boil and that volume starts to rise, I can just release it really quick and you see all those bubbles just drop right out of the way. Okay, so it's been 3 minutes again. Release the vacuum and turn off the motor. Now I'm going to let this set up. For the demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and leave it here. But I wouldn't recommend that during class time, because that might be in somebody else's way. While this is setting up, I don't need to top off any extra plaster. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this bowl while the plaster's still wet. We never, ever, ever dump plaster down the sink. Always use the plaster waste buckets. Okay, so once this sets up enough that I can carve the necessary information in it, I can also pop the bottom off if I want. So it usually takes about 15 minutes or so for this to completely set. Now there are 3 crucial pieces of information that need to be on here. Number 1, my initials, S, M. It really sucks if you ruin somebody else's mold. Number 2 is 70G. That's how much metal needs to go in here. And then number 3, I'm going to cast this in bronze. So I'll put a B. Now there is one more piece of information that may need to be on here, which is if you are casting something that is not wax. You know, you could have paper, you could have wood, you could have plastic, you could have something that is not wax in here, or you could write 12-hour if you have something other than wax that needs a 12-hour burnout. So now that I have my mold prepared, I have the rubber bottom off, I have all of my tape off, I have the necessary information carved into the top. Now I'm ready to load it into the kiln. Most of the time, I will be the one loading the kiln. Occasionally, if you finish a flask late, you might be responsible for loading your own flask into the kiln. When we open up the kiln, we see a lot of kind of broken bricks laid around. Basically, the reason for those broken bricks is so that we can have space underneath our flask. The space is necessary for all the stuff that's in there to melt and come out. If you don't have any space there, you might not get a complete burnout. The stuff will just stay in there, especially if you're doing something that's more than wax. The reason why we need to know what type of metal you're casting is we try to cast all of the bronze flasks at the same, like one right after the other, and then all the silver flasks one right after the other, or vice versa. We really don't want to have to keep exchanging hot crucibles when we're casting. So I'm going to close this door. Closing the latch is incredibly important. If you don't close the latch, then the kiln won't heat properly. And then I will be responsible for programming the kiln for when we need to cast. Okay, so if you recall, our flask needs 70 grams of metal. Where did that number 70 come from? It came from the fact that it was 7 grams of wax. So once again, as kind of our default here, whatever the wax weighs, multiply it by 10, that's how much metal you need. Now technically that's not the correct way to do it. Technically you're supposed to multiply the weight of the metal by that metal's specific gravity. Sometimes it's 11, sometimes it's 14, sometimes it's 9. 10's a nice average, okay? It's not gonna get you into trouble. So we need 70 grams. Always put your weight on the right-hand side. So here's a 50 gram, and here's a 20 gram. There's my 70 grams. Now I'm simply going to add metal until it evens out. You can mix the yellow bronzes. Okay, the ancient bronze that comes from the bookstore is a little bit more coppery color, and the Oster bronze that comes from the bookstore is a little bit more of a yellow color. I'm gonna stick with just pure ancient bronze for this one, just because I have a lot of it. But if you're in a pinch, mixing the yellow bronzes is not a big deal. You should not mix the yellow and the white bronze. Now with the white bronze, it's not in these nice little BBs. It's more in these big chunks. So you want to get close, okay? If you're 15 grams of weight over, that's not really a big deal. You don't want to be like 2 ounces over or anything. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and take a couple of these out. I don't really have to. It's all right if I have a little excess, but perfect. Now that we have our metal weighed out, I want to dump it into this little ceramic cup. Now these BBs, these little metal BBs, have a tendency to just go flying everywhere, so be gentle. Now that my metal's in this nice little cup, I can get ready to cast. So this is the torch that we are going to be using to melt our metal. Basically this is an oxyacetylene torch. It's the same torch that, you know, maybe one of your grandparents has in their garage. Maybe you're related to somebody that does a little bit of torch welding. This is a really common torch that people have. The fuel is acetylene, and the air in this case is compressed oxygen. Acetylene by itself is hot enough to melt the metals that we work with. Adding the oxygen amplifies that, so it makes it much hotter. The first thing that we need to do is we need to turn on these tanks. So we start by turning the nozzle at the top. Turn that one. You don't need to crank and crank and crank. Actually, that's dangerous. You only want to turn it on enough that you can see these dials start to move. Now, the oxygen needs to be set at 10 PSI. And the way that we set it, we need to look at the green line. We need to open that up a little bit and adjust the regulator so that it is at 10 PSI. The 10 PSI mark doesn't have a number. It's the first big tick mark on the red inside dial. Next is the acetylene. Same thing. Okay, I'm gonna start by opening the main valve. Then I'm gonna check the pressure. The acetylene needs to be set at 5 PSI. So I'm gonna double check. And same thing as the oxygen, the PSI, pounds per square inch, are the red numbers that are on the inside of the dial. It's really important to get those pressures set right, because if you don't get the pressure set right, then you're not gonna have an effective flame. Okay, so now I need to set up the centrifugal casting arm to cast my metal. Basically, the centrifugal casting arm spins around and that centripetal force pushes the metal into your mold. Since we're dealing with such small quantities of metal, we need some other force to get it in there. What we need to do first is we need to wind it up. Right here is a pin that rests against the arm of the centrifugal caster once it's wound up. When I go to cast, I'm going to take the tension off and that pin just drops straight down. So what we want to do is we want to start at the pin, and you're always operating this tool with your hands on the counterweighted side. We want to assume that this side where the crucible and the flask sit are going to be hot. So with both hands, always use both hands, I'm going to wind this up 1, 2, 3 times, and then I'm going to pull up this pin and rest the arm against it. The tension of this resting against this is what helps hold it up. When I'm ready to cast, I'm just going to take the tension off, that pin drops out of the way, and then I just simply let go. The next thing I need to do is I need to find the appropriate crucible. We don't want to cross-contaminate our metals. I definitely don't want somebody mixing some bronze into my silver and contaminating my silver. So for yellow bronze, we look for the crucible that has a B. Now, I haven't used this crucible yet today, so it's not hot. I can handle it with my hands. If it were hot, use a pair of tongs to handle that. So I'm going to take my crucible and I need to slide the crucible in from behind the cradle. There's a little cradle here, and you see how this is tapered, right? We can't just set it down on there. We have to slide it in from the back. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go grab a similar diameter flask, because I need to find the proper cradle that's going to hold my flask at the proper height. If I have too deep of a flask, the metal's going to come out like this, you know, and it's not going to hit my mold. If I have too shallow of a flask or of a cradle, it's going to lift my flask up too high. So we have different depths that accommodate different diameters of flasks, because we have all kinds of flasks that are different diameters. So I know this is the shallowest one because this is our smallest flask. I'm going to go ahead and set that there. I can even double check by pushing this forward, and you want to get the nozzle of the crucible as close to the center of that flask as possible. Next, I'm going to check my workspace. I want to make sure my striker is here. This is our bronze graphite stirring stick. We have this graphite stirring stick. You never want to use anything that's going to contaminate, so you don't want to use like a steel stirring stick. The graphite actually helps to remove impurities. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the torch in my left hand, and I'm going to be stirring my metal with my right hand. I want to make sure that that torch flame is 1 inch from my metal. Too far, and I'm not going to get effective heat. Too close, and I risk dunking the torch into molten metal, and you never ever want to dunk the torch into molten metal. So I'm stirring with my right hand until it's a consistently smooth texture, like honey. And then I'm going to set the stick down. I'm going to sprinkle some borax, which is a flux agent that kind of cleans my metal. The torch never moves. Then my other hand comes here, the pin drops out of the way, and I simply let go, and everything flings into place. Okay, so when I get ready to reach in and grab that flask, I'm going to use these tongs, and I'm going to use this part of the tongs. I'm not going to grab with the wide part. I'm going to grab with the little fingers. When I reach in there, I want to hold the tongs exactly how you see me. My hand, the back of my hand is facing, and when I reach in there, I'm gonna grab with the little finger and I'm gonna immediately just turn the flask on its side. Anytime you're carrying a flask, you always hold it on its side. If you slip, it's not gonna fall out. If you lose your grip, if I'm holding it like this and I slip, it's gonna slip out. Well, most of the time. So always hold it to the side. If you hold your hand this way, when you turn your wrist, the opening in the bottom of the flask is going to be facing the right direction, so you can just gently set it down. Okay, so now I'm going to reach in and I'm going to grab my flask. We do have large gloves. If you're not accustomed to sticking your hand into a box that is 900 degrees, it doesn't really bother me. I can do this quickly. Remember, I'm going to reach in there, turn it to its side, pull it out, and shut the door, all in one fluid motion. I'm going to set the flask down in the cradle, latch the door. Okay, I'm going to get my torch lit. When you light your torch, you don't want it blasting out of there, but you want a nice feathery flame that isn't putting out a lot of soot. We don't want to see a lazy flame here. And so basically I'm going to turn on my oxygen nice and slow until I get a nice sharp little cone. Then I'm going to rest my torch right on the edge of the bin here, keeping it about an inch from my metal. I'm going to use my stirring stick, and I'm going to gently start moving things around. You need to give a minute for that metal to get hot. And what it does is it kind of melts into itself first, and then it'll melt down into a nice puddle. You can really keep the torch in one spot and move the metal to where the heat is. So at this point, I have some metal that's molten and some that's not yet. And you can feel those molten chunks kind of floating around in there. We want this to feel consistently melted. It'll feel like, basically like the consistency of honey. And make sure you're feeling the metal and not the rough crucible below it. Now you don't want to overheat your metal because then it'll start to boil. Now that I feel that this is pretty consistently melted, I'm going to set down the stick. I'm going to pick up the flux, good sprinkle of flux. The pin drops out of the way. And there goes my metal. And we just let this stop on its own. Now you should make note that I never moved the torch. The torch stays on the metal the whole time. Now that the spinning has stopped, I'm going to get my tongs. I need to grab the frame, the cradle that is holding the crucible. I need to slide that out of the way. Next, I need to pick up my crucible always on its side, and then I'm gonna set it on a fire brick. This flask is extremely hot. It just came out of a kiln that's 900 degrees, and now it's full of molten metal. You should have a little excess metal. We call that the button. There should be enough metal that you completely filled your mold, and there should be a little excess left over. I would say this is a lot of excess, so maybe my weight was just a little off, or maybe I cut too much sprue off when I was investing. But if you don't see a button, if you see a hole, that's an indication that there's a problem. Maybe some of your metal stayed in the crucible. If that's the case, you can hurry up and try to remelt it, wind up the arms and try to remelt it and cast again. A hole could be an indication that you just miscalculated your weight and you didn't have enough metal, or it could be an indication that there's a crack in your mold and your metal went and filled in that crack. I'm gonna let this sit for 10-15 minutes, and then I'm gonna quench it. Okay, so I have my flask here. I've allowed it to cool for a few minutes. Now I'm gonna plunge it into our quench pail. Quench pail is kind of gross, full of old plaster and stuff like that. I need to pay attention. If this starts like really vibrating, it's probably not solidified enough, so I need to pull it back out. Okay. All right, so it feels pretty good. I can go ahead and set it down. Now I'm just gonna use an old butter knife to dig the plaster out. I'm gonna be careful not to scrape my project. As long as I keep my hands under the water, I'm fine. If I pull my hands out to look at this thing is hot enough that it could burn my hands. Okay, so it is super important to clean the flask. The plaster investment is acidic, and so if we leave that investment on the flasks, they will corrode prematurely. And so we want to take care of these and keep them as long as possible. So I spend a lot of time cleaning all the crud off the flask, making it really nice and clean. Now I'm going to try to clean my project. I can feel the ring, get all this nasty plaster off of here. I'm just using a toothbrush, old toothbrush we have in the studio. So right now, I have kind of an interesting situation. There it is, where the metal didn't completely fill my third object. And I don't know why. It's almost like a bit of the plaster investment, one of my sprues collapsed or something. Now, odd things happen in casting, and you cannot expect a 100% success rate. And so you need to put yourself in a position where, you know, you can address mistakes, because they happen. You could do everything perfectly, and for some reason your cast does not come out right. It works the other way too, where you can really screw some stuff up and it turns out just fine. And that's one of the things I find really frustrating with casting, is sometimes there's no rhyme or reason as to why one thing works and one thing doesn't. You know, sometimes it's just the nature of the solder gods on that particular day. So from here, we're going to take these objects and we're going to put them in the pickle. And I want to get as much plaster off as I can, because the pickle doesn't do anything about plaster. But it is going to take all this black oxidation off, and they're going to turn into nice bright pink and yellowy forms. Okay, so now that we have successfully cast, we need to shut the torch down. This is super important. We cannot leave the torch tanks on when we're not using them. The torch always leaks a little bit of gas. And so just for the sake of not wasting all of our oxygen and acetylene, it's also a significant fire hazard. I mean, you know, if you left the tanks on and went away for the weekend, you know, the whole building could fill up with acetylene. So what we need to do, all we need to do to shut the tanks off is turn off the main valve at the top of the tank. This one, main valve, not the regulator valve. Once we turn off the main valve, we need to bleed the lines. We need to get all of the air and all of the fuel out of these lines. Okay, that's also really important if there was a fire or something like that. You know, we don't want that little bit of fuel that's left in these lines to aid in that fire. And then the very last thing is to hang up the hose.